She didn't ask him a single question. She just looked at him, the worn jacket, the scuffed boots, the calluses on his hands, and made up her mind. Celeste Warren set the check down on her desk, let her eyes drag across it like it offended her, and then, without one word of explanation, she picked it up with both hands and tore it clean in half. Right there, in the middle of the lobby, in front of everyone. $5 million, ripped like junk mail. Ethan Cole didn't move, didn't raise his voice, just stood there while the pieces fluttered to the floor, and something in his eyes shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something that had been through worse and knew exactly what this moment was going to cost her. This kind of story hits different for you, the ones about dignity, about people being underestimated, and what happens. Neck that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to like it, helps more people find stories like this one. Now let's get into it. The morning started the way most of Ethan Cole's mornings did, badly, and with no warning. He'd been up since 5, not because he wanted to be, but because his daughter Mia had a nightmare around 4:30, and by the time he got her settled back down, his brain wouldn't shut off. He lay in the dark for about 20 minutes staring at the ceiling before giving up, pulling on yesterday's jeans and a flannel shirt, and going to the kitchen to make coffee he didn't really taste. Mia was 7. She still had nightmares about her mother leaving, even though it had been 2 years now. She didn't talk about it directly. She was too young to frame it that way, but sometimes she'd wake up crying and say she dreamed. The house was empty and no one came back. Ethan never knew what to say to that. He'd hold her and rub her back and tell her he wasn't going anywhere, and eventually she'd drift off again. He never told her that some nights he had the same dream. By 6:30 he had her breakfast made, her backpack by the door, and her hair in 2 uneven braids that she insisted were fine even though one was clearly lower than the other. He dropped her at school by 7:50, took the long way back through town, and sat in the parking lot of Meridian First National Bank for a few minutes before going in. The check had been sitting in his coat pocket for 3 days. He wasn't sure why he'd waited. Part of it was practical. He had a meeting on Monday and a job site inspection on Tuesday, and the days had slipped by. But part of it was something else, something he hadn't quite named yet. Maybe he was waiting to feel like it was real. The check was for $5 million. Payment in full for the sale of the coal industrial property, 12 acres of commercial land that had belonged to his father, and before that his grandfather, and that Ethan had spent the last 6 years fighting to develop into something that could actually support his family. The buyer was a regional development group called Vantage Holdings. The deal had closed after 14 months of back and forth, 2 rounds of failed financing, 1 lawsuit that got dropped, and 1 very long night in a conference room where Ethan thought the whole thing was going to fall apart over an easement dispute. It didn't fall apart, it held, and now he was sitting in a parking lot in a jacket that had a torn pocket and a coffee stain on the left sleeve, holding a check that made him technically a millionaire. He got out of the car. The branch was on the corner of Halsted and 3rd, a big glass building with polished floors and those low leather chairs arranged near a coffee station that nobody ever seemed to actually use. Ethan came in through the side entrance and took a number, even though only 2 other people were waiting. He stood near the window and watched a pigeon land on the concrete outside and immediately lose interest in whatever it had found there. Next, he walked to the counter. The teller was young, mid-20s, professional, tired in the way that people who deal with the public for 8 hours a day get tired. She smiled at him the way people smile when smiling is part of the job. "Good morning. What can I help you with today? I need to deposit this and cash out a portion." He slid the check through the gap in the glass. Probably $30,000 in cash, the rest deposited. She picked it up, looked at it, looked at him, looked at the check again. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. A small recalibration. The kind people do when they're trying to reconcile 2 things that don't seem to match. "One moment, sir." She stepped away from the window. Ethan watched her walk to the back of the teller area and say something quietly to a woman in a gray blazer who was standing near a computer terminal. The woman in the gray blazer looked over at him. It wasn't a friendly look. It was the look of someone who has already made a decision and is now looking for confirmation that the decision is correct. She walked over. She was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back tight, the kind of put together that takes real effort and wants you to notice. Her name tag said Celeste Warren, branch manager. She carried herself like the title meant something significant, like the square footage of this particular branch was a territory she had built and defended. Good morning. She didn't extend her hand. I'm the branch manager. I understand you'd like to deposit this check and cash 30,000. I see. She looked at the check. This is a significant amount. Yes. Can I ask the nature of the transaction this originates from? Ethan looked at her. It's payment for a real estate sale. The documentation's all filed through the county recorder. The buyer is Vantage Holdings. They're a registered development group. She was still looking at the check, tilting it slightly under the overhead light like she was checking it for watermarks. And you have a relationship with Vantage Holdings? They're the buyer. I'm the seller. Of what property? Coal Industrial. On Route 9. Something shifted in her expression, not softening the opposite. Route 9 wasn't a prestigious address. It was out past the old rail yards, a stretch of land that had been zoned commercial for decades without much actually happening on it. In Celeste Warren's geography of worth, it apparently registered somewhere near the bottom. I'm going to need to verify this check before we can process anything, she said. Okay. Ethan nodded. That's fine. It may take a few days. A few days? Most verification runs same day through. Our procedures for amounts of this size require additional steps, she said, cutting him off with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who was used to cutting people off and calling it policy. Ethan felt the first prickle of something at the back of his neck. He kept his voice even. Could you walk me through the specific steps? I've deposited large checks before. Do you have an account with us? I have a business account and a personal checking account, both with this branch. She seemed mildly surprised by that, but covered it quickly. I'll still need to verify the issuing account before we can proceed. Then proceed. Call the issuing bank. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she picked up the check again and held it in a way that managed to communicate, without a single word, that she was skeptical of it, that she was skeptical of him, that the two things together, this check, didn't add up to something she was prepared to accept without making it uncomfortable. Ma'am, Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. Is there something specific about the check that concerns you? Because I can call Vantage Holdings directly and have their CFO confirm the transaction right now. That won't be necessary. Then what is necessary? She looked at him, really looked at him, in a way that wasn't professional at all. It was the look of a person who had sorted him into a category and was operating from that category with complete confidence. Sir, she said, dropping her voice just enough to signal that she was being patient with him, I need you to understand that a check of this denomination, presented without a prior appointment by an account holder who what? She paused. Finish the sentence, Ethan said. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. They both knew what the end of the sentence was. I'm going to have to ask you to come back another day, she said. If you'd like to schedule an appointment with one of our private banking associates. I don't need a private banking associate. I need you to process my deposit. That's not something I'm able to do today. Ethan stared at her for a moment. The lobby behind him had gotten quieter, not completely silent, but the ambient noise had dropped, the way it does when people sense a confrontation developing and start to pay attention without wanting to look like they're paying attention. I'd like to speak to whoever's above you, Ethan said. I'm the branch manager. I know what you are. Is there a regional director or someone at the corporate level I can contact? You're welcome to call the main customer service line. Okay, he nodded slowly. Give me the check back, then. I'll take it to another branch. She held it for a moment longer than she should have. Then she set it down on the counter between them, and Ethan reached for it, and something in Celeste Warren snapped. Not visibly, not dramatically, just some internal switch that had been under pressure all morning, maybe all week, and his hand reaching for that check was the thing that finally flipped it. She picked the check up with both hands, and she tore it in half. The sound it made was small, paper tearing, barely audible over the air conditioning. But the lobby registered it the collective intake of something wrong, something that wasn't supposed to happen, and for a second, nobody moved. Ethan looked at the two pieces in her hands. That, he said, was a mistake. This check is fraudulent, she said. Her voice was steady, which was impressive, considering what she had just done. I'm exercising my authority as branch manager to destroy a legal financial instrument, Ethan said, in front of witnesses. It's a forgery. No, it isn't. And you know it isn't. You didn't run a single verification check. He looked at her hands. The two halves of $5 million. You didn't call the issuing bank. You didn't check our account history. You didn't do anything except look at my jacket. Her jaw tightened. I'd like you to step back from the counter, she said. I'm not going to step back. Sir, I'm an account holder of 15 years. That check is legitimate. What you just did is potentially criminal, and at minimum it's a violation of federal banking regulations and your own institution's policies. He kept his voice low. Quiet. The kind of quiet that's worse than yelling. So before you say one more word about me stepping back from the counter, I'd suggest you think very carefully about what you want to do next. Celeste turned to the security officer near the door. His name tag read Calvin Reed. He was built solid and had the look of a man who'd seen plenty of situations go sideways and knew the difference between a real threat and something else entirely. Calvin, she said, can you escort this gentleman out? Calvin walked over slowly. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the two halves of the check still in Celeste's hand. He looked at Celeste. On what grounds, he said. Excuse me? On what grounds am I escorting him out? His voice was completely neutral. He hasn't raised his voice. He hasn't threatened anyone. He's an account holder. Celeste stared at him. I'm asking you to remove him from the premises. I understand what you're asking. I'm asking why. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Off to the left, near the coffee station nobody used, a woman in her 30s had her phone out and pointed in their direction. She wasn't hiding it. She'd been recording for at least 2 minutes. Nora Bennett, standing at her workstation near the teller windows, watched all of this with her hands folded on her keyboard, and her face very still. She was 29, had worked at this branch for 4 years, and had seen Celeste Warren refuse service to people before. She'd seen her do it with a smile, with a policy excuse, with a phone call that went nowhere. She'd never seen her tear a check in half. Nora opened a new tab on her computer. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet, but she started taking notes. Back at the counter, Ethan was still standing exactly where he'd been standing. He had not stepped back. He had not raised his voice. He had not done a single thing that could be used to justify what was happening to him. He was simply there, steady and present, in his worn jacket and his scuffed boots, holding his ground in the way that people hold their ground when they've had a lot of practice doing it and they know the difference between a fight worth having and one that isn't. This one was worth having. I'm not leaving, he said. Celeste looked at him. He could see something behind her eyes, not quite fear, but the first distant relative of it. The moment when you've done a thing and can't undo it and are starting to understand the full shape of what you've done. She set the two halves of the check on the counter between them and walked away. Ethan looked down at them. He thought about his father, who had bought that land with money saved over 12 years of shift work. He thought about Mia, asleep in her bed an hour ago with her uneven braids. He thought about 14 months of negotiations, and the conference room, and the easement dispute, and the night he'd driven home at 2 a.m, thinking it was all over. Then he carefully picked up both halves of the check and put them in his shirt pocket. And he waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for exactly. Some part of him knew that whatever had just happened was not the end of anything. The woman with the phone was still recording. Calvin Reed was still standing nearby, watching the floor with an expression that meant he was thinking hard about something. The lobby had the charged stillness of a place where something has already happened, but the consequences haven't arrived yet. In the back office, Celeste Warren sat down at her desk and opened her computer. And in the security room down the hall, a set of cameras quietly continued recording everything. Ethan Cole buttoned his jacket, the torn pocket, the coffee stain on the sleeve, and looked out through the big glass windows at the street outside. Pigeon was gone. The concrete where it had stood was just concrete. He looked back at the counter, at the teller who had started all this, now carefully not looking at him, at the lobby full of people pretending they hadn't seen what they'd just seen, at the space where Celeste Warren had been standing when she tore his check in half with both hands like it was nothing. He thought, she has no idea what she just set in motion. He sat down in one of the low leather chairs by the coffee station. He was going to wait. He didn't order coffee. He didn't pull out his phone. He just sat in that low leather chair near the window and waited, the two halves of the check folded inside his shirt pocket, close enough to feel when he breathed. The lobby moved around him the way lobbies do people coming in, taking numbers, conducting small transactions, leaving. The teller who had first called Celeste over was now helping an older man with a withdrawal and keeping her eyes firmly away from the left side of the room where Ethan sat. Coffee station nobody used hummed its quiet hum. Somewhere in the back offices, a door opened and closed. Calvin Reed had returned to his post near the entrance, but he was not doing what security officers usually do at posts, standing with a kind of vacant alertness, body present while mind drifts. He was paying attention. Specifically and deliberately paying attention, the way a man pays attention when he has decided that something matters and he intends to be a witness to it. The woman who had been recording near the coffee station was gone. She'd left about 10 minutes after Celeste walked away, slipped out through the side door, without making a scene, phone tucked in her jacket. Ethan had noticed her go. He didn't know her name. He didn't know yet what she intended to do with what she'd captured. He found out 40 minutes later, when his own phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his lawyer, a woman named Sandra Park, who had represented him through the Vantage Holdings deal and 2 prior property disputes. The text said, "Are you at Meridian First National on Halstead right now?" He typed back, "Yes." 3 seconds later, she called him. "There's a video," Sandra said, skipping any greeting. "It's already got 8,000 views and it's climbing. Someone posted it on 3 different platforms about 20 minutes ago. It shows a bank manager tearing up what looks like a significant check while you're standing at the counter." Ethan was quiet for a moment. How much of it did they get? Enough. The audio's a little rough, but you can hear the part where you told her it was a mistake. A pause. "Ethan, what was the check for?" "The coal industrial closing." Another pause, longer this time. "The 5 million?" "Yes," and she tore it in half in front of the lobby. Sandra made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Then don't leave. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. I'm calling their legal department right now." She hung up. Ethan put the phone back in his pocket and looked out the window. A delivery truck was double parked across the street. 2 men were unloading boxes with the unhurried efficiency of people who did this exact thing every day and had stopped thinking about it. He watched them for a while and thought about nothing in particular. Inside the branch, Nora Bennett was still at her workstation. She'd been there the whole time, doing her job with a kind of mechanical steadiness that was covering a great deal of internal noise. She'd processed 4 transactions in the last hour and could not have told you a single detail about any of them. She had a document open in a second browser tab. It was titled simply Incident Log Date. She'd been adding to it in small increments whenever she was certain no one was watching her screen. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it. She wasn't sure it would matter. She'd worked at this branch long enough to have seen things get reported and disappear into whatever administrative process existed to make sure nothing uncomfortable survived. Kept writing. 9:14 a.m. customer presented check at window 3. Teller J. Morales directed customer to branch manager. 9:17 a.m. branch manager C. Warren approached counter. Customer identified himself as account holder, provided details of transaction. 9:23 a.m. branch manager requested customer vacate premises without completing verification process. No verification of issuing account was attempted at any point prior to this request. 9:26 a.m. branch manager physically destroyed check. Document was torn in 2 pieces in front of customer and multiple lobby witnesses. 9:27 a.m. branch manager instructed security officer C. Reed to remove customer. Security officer declined, citing absence of cause. She paused over that last line. Declined. That was the right word. Calvin had stood there and looked at Celeste Warren and essentially told her no, and the thing about that was that nobody in this branch did that. People found ways around it. They said they needed to check something. They said they'd be right back. They redirected. They didn't say no, she added. Security officer's refusal appeared to surprise branch manager significantly. Then she saved the document to a personal USB drive she kept in her desk drawer, the kind of small habit that looks like nothing until it isn't. In the back office, Celeste Warren was on the phone. She'd been on the phone for most of the last 40 minutes first, with the branch's compliance coordinator, then with someone in the legal department whose name she already couldn't remember, then with the friend she'd worked with at a previous bank who she sometimes called when she needed to think out loud. The friend had not been comforting. The legal department had been worse. You physically destroyed the document, the compliance coordinator had said, and there was something in the way she said it flat, careful, slightly horrified that had lodged itself in Celeste's chest like a splinter. I had reasonable grounds to believe. What grounds? Walk me through the verification steps you completed before making that determination. Celeste had walked her through them. It had not taken long, because there were no verification steps. She had looked at the check, looked at the man holding it, and made a judgment. The judgment had felt solid at the time. It felt considerably less solid now. Celeste, the coordinator, had said, I need to ask you directly, did you contact the issuing institution to verify the account? Not yet. Did you run the customer's account history? I was in the process. Did you consult with any member of the compliance team before rendering a determination of fraud? Silence. Celeste. No, the coordinator had gone quiet for a moment. Then I'm going to escalate this. Please don't take any further action with the customer or the document until you hear from me. That was 30 minutes ago. Celeste had heard nothing since. She sat at her desk now, with the two halves of the check in front of her. She'd taken them from the counter after Ethan sat down, intending to lock them in her drawer, and stared at them with the expression of someone who has thrown a rock through a window and is only now registering the size of the window. The check looked real. It looked exactly real. The paper weight, the microprinting along the bottom edge, the routing and account numbers in their correct format. She'd told herself it was a forgery because she needed it to be a forgery. Because the alternative, that this man in a work jacket had come into her branch on a Tuesday morning with a legitimate $5 million check, and she had destroyed it based on nothing but the way he looked, was not something she could afford to be true. She picked up her phone again and called the number on the check's issuing bank. She'd looked it up herself rather than going through the compliance process because she needed to know before anyone else did. The line rang twice. Hartwell Community Bank. How can I direct your call? I need to verify a recently issued cashier's check. This is an account inquiry from a receiving institution. One moment. Hold music. Bad hold music, the kind that loops every 40 seconds. Then, thank you for holding. I can help you with that verification. Can I get the check number? She read it off. A pause. Typing. Another pause. Yes, ma'am. That check was issued 3 days ago from the account of Vantage Holdings, LLC. The funds are confirmed and the check is valid. Celeste Warren sat very still. Are you certain? Yes, ma'am. Fully funded, no stop payment on record, no flags. Is there anything else I can help you with? She hung up without answering. She sat there for a long time. Then she looked at the security camera in the upper corner of her office. The small blinking light that meant it was recording. It recorded everything in the branch, the lobby, the teller windows, the hallway, her office. Everything. She thought about that for a while. She thought about the video that she didn't know about yet, the one already circulating with several thousand views. She thought about Sandra Park, who was at that moment on the phone with the bank's legal department. She thought about Calvin Reed standing at his post with his very deliberate attention. She thought about Nora Bennett at her workstation, whose screen she couldn't see from here. She thought about Ethan Cole sitting in that leather chair by the coffee station, not leaving. She made a decision. It was the wrong decision, as wrong decisions often feel urgently right in the moment you make them. She got up from her desk, walked down the short hallway past the teller windows, and turned left toward the small room that served as the branch's security and data hub. It was a cramped space, 2 monitors, a rack of equipment, a rolling chair, and it was, at this hour, unoccupied. The security officer on monitoring duty was on his lunch break. She sat down at the main terminal. She knew the system well enough. She'd had to access it twice before, once after a robbery attempt 2 years ago, once when a teller had a dispute about the timeline of a transaction. She knew how the footage was organized, how it was archived, what the backup cycle looked like. She pulled up this morning's recordings. The lobby camera, counter camera, her office camera. She moved her cursor to the delete function. She didn't hear the door open behind her. Miss Warren. Calvin Reed's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, precise, and controlled, in the way of someone who is very certain of what they're doing and doesn't need volume to communicate that certainty. Celeste's hand froze over the mouse. Step away from the terminal, please. She turned. Calvin was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides. His face was the same face it always was, no anger, no drama. Just a man who had decided where he stood. I'm reviewing footage for an incident report, she said. You don't have authorization to delete or modify recorded footage without a written compliance order. That's in the security policy, Section 4, Paragraph 2. He hadn't moved from the doorway. And what you were about to do doesn't look like reviewing. You don't know what I was about to do. Your cursor was on the delete function. Silence. Move away from the terminal, he said again. Please. Something in Celeste's face changed. Not broke, not yet, but shifted in a way that suggested the structure beneath it was taking on weight it wasn't built to carry. She pushed the chair back and stood up. She didn't say anything. There was, for the first time all morning, nothing to say. Calvin stepped aside to let her pass. She walked by him without looking at him and went back down the hallway. He sat down at the terminal himself, pulled up the footage management system, and did the thing that Celeste had not been able to bring herself to do. He locked the files. Rote protected them with his security code, flagged the morning's recordings as evidence pending review. Then he took out his personal phone and took photographs of the screen, showing the footage timestamps and his locking actions. He wasn't sure if any of this would matter. He'd worked security long enough to know that institutions had a way of making inconvenient truths inconvenient to access. But he'd done what he could with what he had, and sometimes that was the thing. He went back to his post. In the lobby, Ethan Cole was still sitting in the leather chair. He'd been sitting there for just under an hour. His phone had buzzed twice more Sandra again, and then a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a local news station asking for comment. He hadn't called the news station back. He wasn't sure he was going to. A young woman approached him. She was carrying a bottle of water, and she held it out to him with an uncertain expression, like she wasn't sure he'd take it. I saw what happened, she said. I'm sorry. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took the water. Thank you. She hesitated. Is there anything? I'm okay. She nodded and went back to her seat. She was one of maybe 6 people who had been in the lobby for most of the last hour, people who had finished their transactions but hadn't left, who were sitting with their phones or their bags or their coffee cups from somewhere else, watching without quite looking like they were watching. Ethan opened the water bottle and drank some. He thought about Mia, who would be done with school in about 5 hours. He thought about the braids and the nightmare, and the way she'd asked him last week if they were rich. He'd told her they were comfortable. She'd said that wasn't the same thing. He'd agreed with her, and they'd moved on. He didn't know what to tell her now. His phone buzzed again. Sandra, they're sending someone, she said when he picked up. Regional president. His name is Adrian Brooks. He's already in the car. How'd that happen? Apparently the video crossed some threshold online, and someone at corporate saw it and made some calls. Also, I may have sent a certified communication to their legal department about 20 minutes ago. Sandra, I know, but Ethan, they destroyed a $5 million check. They don't get to just handle this quietly with a phone call. Couldn't argue with that. How long? He said 45 minutes. He's coming from the regional office downtown. Okay. Don't leave. I wasn't planning to. He hung up and looked out the window again. The delivery truck was gone. The street was just a street ordinary, indifferent, doing what streets do. He felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with being up since 5. It was a different kind of tired. The kind that comes from having to fight for things that shouldn't require fighting. He knew that kind of tired well. It was an old companion. Nora Bennett finished her incident log and saved the final version to the USB drive and also emailed it to her personal address. She did this quickly, without drama, the way people do things when they've thought them through carefully and decided they're the right thing to do, even though they're also a little bit scared. Then she deleted the email from her sent folder. Then she thought about it and wrote it down again in a separate document and saved that too. She was not sure any of this would help anyone. She was not sure she wouldn't get fired for it. She'd been at this branch 4 years, and in those 4 years she'd watched people like Ethan Cole get turned away from windows, get redirected to services they didn't need, get managed out the door with language so smooth you almost didn't notice you were being dismissed. She'd never said anything because she told herself she was new, and then because she told herself she wasn't sure, and then because she told herself there was nothing to say. This morning, a manager had torn a $5 million check in half in front of a lobby full of witnesses. There was something to say now. She pulled up the internal reporting portal, the one for submitting compliance concerns, and started filling out the form. Name, date, description of incident. She typed slowly and carefully, using her own words, not the words of the form which were designed to make things vague. She made it specific. She made it clear. She attached the incident log. She hit submit. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at her screen and thought, well, okay, that's done. Outside, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. It sat there for a moment before a man got out mid-50s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, the kind of man who carries his authority in his posture rather than his clothes. He stood by the car and looked at the branch through the glass for a long moment. He had the expression of someone who has received bad news and is taking a few seconds to fully accept it before walking into the room where the bad news happened. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up a slim briefcase, and walked toward the entrance. Calvin Reed saw him come through the door and recognized him immediately. He'd met Adrian Brooks once before at a regional staff conference 2 years ago. He remembered him as the kind of man who asked good questions and listened to the answers. Calvin nodded to him. Adrian Brooks nodded back. Then he looked around the lobby at the teller windows, at the people still sitting in the waiting area, at the general atmosphere of a branch that was holding itself very carefully together, and his eyes settled on the man in the worn jacket sitting in the leather chair by the coffee station. He walked over. Ethan looked up. "Mr. Cole," Adrian said. He didn't put out his hand immediately. He just stood there and looked at him with an expression that was neither apologetic nor defensive. "I'm Adrian Brooks. I'm the regional president for Meridian First National." He paused. "I got here as fast as I could." Ethan studied him for a moment. "Okay, I'd like to understand what happened this morning." "I'm sure you would." Adrian sat down in the chair across from him. Not behind a desk, not in a private office. Right there, in the lobby, in a chair that was slightly too low for someone his height, in front of everyone who was still watching. That was a choice, Ethan thought. Whether it was a calculated choice or just how this man operated, he couldn't tell yet. "Can you walk me through it?" Adrian said. Ethan reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the two halves of the check, still folded, still carrying the crease from an hour of being close to his chest, and laid them on the small table between the chairs. Adrian looked at them. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did a slow, careful reckoning with what he was looking at, and what it meant, and what it was going to cost. "She tore it," Ethan said. "Yes." Adrian's voice was quiet. "I can see that. Without verification, without cause. Without anything. I understand." Ethan looked at him. "Do you?" Adrian didn't answer that right away. He looked at the two halves of the check on the table between them and seemed to be measuring something not the situation exactly. Something more fundamental than that. Then he looked up at Ethan Cole, sitting in his worn jacket in a bank where he had been a customer for 15 years, and said, "Sir, I'm sorry." The word landed differently than Celeste Warren's clipped professional courtesy. It landed like something actual. Ethan wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. He'd been in enough rooms with enough people to know that sorry was sometimes just the first move in a longer game. But he kept listening, because whatever came next, he was going to be ready for it. Adrian Brooks did not go to Celeste Warren's office first. He stayed in that low leather chair across from Ethan Cole for another 12 minutes, asking questions in the careful way that people ask questions when they already suspect the answers and are building a record rather than satisfying curiosity. He asked Ethan to walk through the timeline, start to finish. Ethan did it, without embellishment what he'd said, what she'd said, the exact sequence of events from the moment he handed the check through the window to the moment Celeste picked it up and tore it. He kept his voice even. He didn't editorialize. He'd learned a long time ago that facts presented plainly were more damaging than facts presented with anger, because anger gave people something to focus on other than the facts. Adrian listened without interrupting. He took notes on a small pad he pulled from his jacket pocket, actual handwritten notes, which Ethan found either refreshingly old-fashioned or quietly calculated. He wasn't sure which, and Calvin Reed, Adrian said. "The security officer, he refused to remove you. He asked what grounds. She couldn't give him any. Did he say anything else?" "Not much. He's not a talkative man." Adrian wrote something down. "The woman recording, do you know who she was?" "No. She left before you got here. But you saw her recording. Clearly." Adrian looked at his notepad. Then he looked at the two halves of the check still sitting on the small table between them. He hadn't touched them. He'd looked at them several times, but hadn't reached for them, as if he understood that they weren't his to handle. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I need to go speak with my branch manager. I'd like to ask you to stay a little longer, if you're able. I've been here almost 2 hours." "I know. I'm asking anyway." Ethan looked at him. 30 minutes. That's fair." Adrian stood, buttoned his jacket. Then he paused. For what it's worth, and I understand if it isn't worth much right now, I want you to know that what you've described is not something I'm going to minimize or manage around. Ethan didn't respond to that. Not because he was being hostile, but because he'd heard enough people tell him what they intended to do and had learned to wait and watch what they actually did. Adrian seemed to understand this. He nodded once and walked away. The lobby had thinned out some. A few of the people who'd been sitting and watching had finally left. A new round of customers had come in who didn't know what had happened and were simply conducting their Tuesday business with no idea they were walking through the aftermath of something. Ethan watched them for a while. He thought about calling Sandra but decided against it. She'd told him to stay and not agree to anything. He was staying and hadn't agreed to anything. There was nothing to report. His phone showed 11:48 a.m. Mia got out of school at 3. He had time. Down the hall, Calvin Reed was standing outside the door of the security room when Adrian Brooks approached him. Calvin straightened slightly, not the rigid attention of someone performing deference, but the natural adjustment of a person who takes their job seriously and recognizes when someone above them in the chain deserves a straight answer. "I need the morning footage," Adrian said. "All of it. Lobby, teller windows, hallway, offices." "Already locked and flagged," Calvin said. Adrian paused. "When?" "About 90 minutes ago. Warren came into the security room while I was—" He chose his next word carefully, "while I was monitoring. She accessed the terminal and had her cursor on the delete function for the morning recordings. I asked her to step away. She did. I locked the files immediately after and photographed the screen." Adrian stared at him for a moment. "She tried to delete the footage. She had the cursor on the delete function. She hadn't executed it yet when I came in. And you stopped her?" "Yes." A long beat. Adrian's face was doing the same thing it had done when he looked at the two halves of the check, that slow, careful reckoning, the kind that happens when a situation turns out to be significantly worse than you were prepared for. "I need those photographs," Adrian said. Calvin reached into his shirt pocket and produced his phone. He'd already airdropped the images to himself and printed 2 copies on the small printer in the security room. He handed Adrian a folded sheet of paper. Adrian unfolded it, looked at it, folded it again, and put it in his jacket pocket. "Mr. Reed," he said, "is there anything else I should know before I go talk to her?" Calvin thought about it. "She called the issuing bank herself," he said, "about an hour ago. I wasn't in the room, but the call log on the branch's main line shows an outgoing call to Hartwell Community Bank at 10:43. She verified the check herself, after she destroyed it." Adrian closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. Then he opened them. "Thank you." "Yes, sir." Adrian walked down the hall to Celeste Warren's office. The door was closed. He knocked once, which was a courtesy, and then opened it without waiting for an answer, which was not. Celeste was at her desk. She'd clearly been expecting him. Her posture had the stiffness of someone who has been sitting in a particular arrangement for a while because they knew someone was coming and they wanted to look composed when they arrived. She almost managed it. "Adrian," she said. "Celeste." He sat down across from her without being invited to, which was the second thing he'd done in 60 seconds that wasn't a courtesy. He put his notepad on her desk. He didn't open it. "Tell me what happened this morning." "I had concerns about the validity of a check presented for deposit." "What concerns specifically?" She'd had time to prepare for this. The amount was significant. The account holder presented without an appointment. The check was from an institution we don't have a standing relationship with. "Those are general observations," Adrian said, "not fraud indicators." "What specific features of the check led you to a determination of fraud?" Pause. Small but audible. "The overall presentation of the transaction concerned me." "The overall presentation," he repeated. "Yes." Celeste. "What verification steps did you complete before you destroyed that document?" The word "destroyed" landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She'd been using the word "torn" in her own head, which was softer. Destroyed was accurate, and she knew it. "I was in the process of—" "What verification steps did you complete before?" She looked at him. He looked back. There was no anger in his face, which was somehow worse than anger. Anger could be matched, deflected, managed. This was just a man sitting across a desk from her, waiting for the truth, with the patience of someone who already knew what it was. "I hadn't completed formal verification steps," she said. "You destroyed a $5 million check without completing any verification steps." "I intended to—" "Did you contact the issuing institution?" "Not before." "Did you run the account holder's history with this branch?" Going to consult compliance? No. The word sat there. Adrian leaned back slightly. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to fully understand before they respond to it. Celeste, I've known you 7 years. You've run this branch well. You know the protocols. You know what verification requires. He paused. So help me understand how you got from a customer presenting a check to tearing it in half without a single verification step. Celeste's hands were flat on the desk. She'd been pressing them down against the surface for the last few minutes, which was a thing she did when she was trying to hold something in. He didn't look like someone who would have a legitimate $5 million check. There it was, out in the room now where it couldn't be taken back. He didn't look like it, Adrian said. I know how that sounds. Do you? She pressed her hands harder against the desk. I made a judgment call based on what he was wearing, based on the totality of Celeste. His voice was still even, still controlled. But the evenness had changed quality. It was the evenness of pressure, not patience. I've spoken with the account holder. I've spoken with Calvin Reed. I've seen the photograph of the security terminal with your cursor on the delete function. He let that sit for a second. The check was real. I already had it verified by our own compliance team on the drive over here. Vantage Holdings issued it 3 days ago. The funds are confirmed. The transaction is completely legitimate. Celeste said nothing. You destroyed a legitimate $5 million check, Adrian said. Then, when you called the issuing bank and found out it was legitimate, you went to the security room and attempted to delete the footage of what you'd done. A security officer had to physically intervene to stop you. He paused. Is that an accurate account? I wasn't going to. Celeste. She stopped. Is that an accurate account? He asked again. A long moment. The longest of the morning. Possibly the longest of her professional career. Yes, she said. The word cost her something visible. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry, but working to stay that way. She was not a person who fell apart easily. She'd built her entire career on not falling apart easily. But there was a structural problem now, and it wasn't hidden anymore, and she could feel the weight of it. I need you to go home, Adrian said, today, right now. Adrian, this is not a negotiation. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation. HR will contact you by end of day. You are not to access any branch systems, client records, or security data from this point forward. He stood up. I'm sorry it came to this. 7 years, she said. Her voice was controlled, but something in it had cracked very slightly. Like a hairline fracture you can feel more than see. I know. 7 years without a single serious complaint. Top performing branch 3 years running. She stopped herself. Took a breath. I made one bad decision. Adrian looked at her. You made several. The check was the first. Attempting to delete the evidence was something else entirely. He picked up his notepad. Go home, Celeste. Don't make any public statements. Don't contact the customer or any of the witnesses. Let the process run. She looked like she wanted to say something more. She didn't say it. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her desk, stood up, straightened her blazer with a precision that was almost painful to watch, and walked out of her office without looking at him again. Adrian stood in her empty office for a moment. He looked at her desk, the nameplate, the framed photo of 2 teenage kids, the small succulent plant on the windowsill that had been recently watered, the desk of a person who had built something real here and had dismantled a significant portion of it in about 90 seconds this morning. He felt something close to sorrow about that. Not enough to change anything, but close to it. He went back to the lobby. Ethan was still in the leather chair. He'd been watching Celeste Warren walk through the lobby with her bag, head straight, pace measured, the performance of dignity under pressure, and out the glass doors to the parking lot. He tracked her without turning his head, which was something he'd gotten good at over the years. Adrian sat back down across from him. She's been placed on administrative leave, he said. Effective immediately. A full investigation is being opened. Ethan nodded slowly. What did she tell you? She confirmed the sequence of events as you described them. She also confirmed that she called the issuing bank after the fact and verified the check was legitimate. Ethan looked at him. She verified it after she destroyed it. Yes, and then went to delete the security footage. Adrian's expression shifted slightly. How did you know about that? I didn't. Not until just now. Ethan let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. So it's worse than I thought. It's more complicated, yes. Adrian leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Mr. Cole, I want to be direct with you. The bank is fully liable for the destruction of that instrument. We'll issue a replacement check. Vantage Holdings will need to be contacted to formally cancel the original and reissue, and our legal team will coordinate that process. There will be no cost to you. We'll also cover any legal fees you've incurred in connection with this morning's events. Sandra Park, Ethan said. She's been on the phone with your legal department for 2 hours. I know, I spoke with our general counsel on the way over. Adrian paused. I also want to offer a formal written apology from the institution. That will be part of the record. Okay, and I want to ask what else you need. Ethan looked at him carefully. What else I need? Yes, not what else I'm owed. Not what the bank is legally obligated to provide. What I need. Yes. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the two halves of the check on the table. He looked at the lobby, the teller windows, the people coming and going, the coffee station with its ambient hum. He thought about the look on Celeste Warren's face when she'd picked the check up with both hands. The total confidence of it. The complete absence of doubt. He'd seen that look before. Not always in a bank. Not always directed at him. But he'd seen it enough times to know it wasn't personal, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't that Celeste Warren had looked at Ethan Cole specifically and decided he was less than. She'd looked at a category, a jacket, a pair of boots, a particular kind of hands, and reacted to the category. Ethan had just been whoever happened to be standing inside it that morning. That was the part that didn't go away with an apology and a replacement check. I want to know what the bank is going to do, Ethan said. Not about her, about the next person. Adrian was quiet. Because she didn't invent that decision out of nowhere, Ethan said. She's been making smaller versions of it for a long time, probably. And nobody stopped her. Not because people didn't notice your teller noticed. Your security officer noticed. They noticed, and they didn't have a mechanism to do anything about it except watch. He paused. So what's the mechanism going to be? Adrian looked at him. That's a bigger conversation than I can have in a lobby. I know it is. I'm telling you it's the conversation I want to have. Okay, Adrian nodded once. We'll have it. Not just us. Your compliance team. Your HR leadership. Maybe an external review, somebody who doesn't work for Meridian and doesn't have a stake in making the findings comfortable. That's a significant ask. It's a significant thing that happened. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. You could make a lot of money from this. Lawyers are going to tell you that. If this morning's events end up in litigation, given the video and the footage, I know what I could make. Well, so why are you sitting here talking about policies? Ethan was quiet for a second. He thought about how to answer that without it sounding like something out of a movie. He didn't have a speech prepared. He'd just been sitting in this chair for 2 hours thinking about things. Because the money doesn't fix anything, he said finally. Not for anyone else. The money goes to me, and in 6 months, nothing about this branch is different, except she doesn't work here anymore, and the bank has slightly less cash. He looked at Adrian. Got the money. I've got more of it now than I know what to do with, which is the whole reason I was here this morning. A pause. What I don't have is any guarantee that the next guy who walks in here looking like me gets treated like a person. Adrian sat back. He was quiet for a longer stretch than he'd been quiet for the whole conversation. Outside, through the big glass windows, the street continued its Tuesday indifference. People walking, a bus stopping and going, a kid on a bike weaving between parked cars. I hear you, Adrian said. I know you do. I'm not sure that's enough yet. Fair. Adrian picked up his notepad. He wrote something, tore the page off cleanly, and slid it across the table to Ethan. It was a cell phone number and a name, his name, with regional president written beneath it in the careful handwriting of someone who learned cursive a long time ago and never fully let it go. That's my direct line. Not the office. Not an assistant. Me. He looked at Ethan. I'd like to meet again properly, with the right people in the room within the next week. Will you come? Ethan looked at the number. He thought about Sandra, who would have opinions about this. He thought about what he'd just said and whether he actually meant it enough to follow through on it. I'll come, he said. He put the number in his shirt pocket, in the same spot where the two halves of the check had been. Then he stood up. Adrian stood too. This time he extended his hand. Ethan looked at it for a moment. This was not a refusal, just a beat of honest acknowledgement that a handshake was a small thing against what had happened in this building today, and then he shook it. Adrian's grip was firm. Ethan's was firmer. Neither of them said anything else. There wasn't much left to say right now. The next thing was going to be actions, not words, and they both knew it. Ethan picked up the two halves of the check from the table. He folded them together and put them in his jacket pocket. Then he walked through the lobby, past the teller windows, past the coffee station with its hum, past the chair where he'd sat for almost 2.5 hours, and out through the glass doors into the November air. Inside the branch, Nora Bennett watched him go. She'd been at her workstation the entire time, working, observing, documenting. Her incident log was submitted. The email to her personal address was sitting in an inbox she'd check later tonight from home. She'd done the things she'd been able to do. She looked at her screen. She had 3 pending transactions to process. She started on the first one. Calvin Reed, at his post near the entrance, watched Ethan walk through the parking lot toward his car. He watched him get in, sit there for a moment without starting the engine, and then start it and pull out. He watched until the car was out of sight. Then he turned back to the lobby and resumed doing what security officers do, watching, waiting, being present in a space that had spent the last several hours containing something it wasn't designed for and was still working out how to recover from. In the back office, Adrian Brooks was on his phone. He was talking to the general counsel. Then he called the compliance director. Then he called someone in corporate communications. Each call was short and direct. He wasn't someone who used 10 words where 5 would do, and right now 5 were usually enough. The branch hummed around him. Teller windows processing transactions. The door opening and closing. The ordinary business of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon trying to reassert itself over a morning that had refused to be ordinary. Somewhere in the footage that Calvin Reed had locked the files sitting untouched now, tagged and protected, and waiting for whatever process was coming, was the full record of what had happened. The check being handed across the counter. The conversation. The moment Celeste Warren picked up that document with both hands. The sound of paper tearing. Ethan Cole's face in the seconds after. It was all there, and it wasn't going anywhere. Ethan sat in his car in the parking lot for about 4 minutes before he started the engine. He wasn't doing anything particular. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't crying, which he'd half expected to feel the pressure of once he was finally alone, that release that sometimes comes after you've held yourself together for a long stretch in front of people. It didn't come. He just sat there, with the engine off and his hands in his lap, and looked at the concrete wall of the building across the street, which had a faded advertisement painted on it for a hardware store that had probably closed 15 years ago. He thought about his father. Not in a sentimental way. Just his father had owned that land on Route 9 for 31 years, and in that time had gone to banks, and meetings, and offices, and had sat across desks from people who looked at his hands and his clothes and decided what kind of man he was. His father had never talked about it directly. He'd just come home some evenings with a particular set to his jaw, and young Ethan had known enough not to ask. Now Ethan was 43, and he had $5 million in a torn check in his jacket pocket, and he was sitting in a parking lot with that same set to his jaw, and the continuity of it was something he hadn't expected to feel so clearly today. He started the car and drove to pick up Mia 3 hours early. She came out of school confused, backpack sliding off one shoulder, both braids still in, though one had migrated even further south than this morning. She got in the car and looked at him. "Did something happen?" "Yeah," he said, "but it's okay now." "You hungry?" "It's 1 o'clock." "I know what time it is." "You hungry?" "Yeah." They went to a diner 6 blocks from school that had vinyl booths and a laminated menu with photographs. Mia got a grilled cheese and a chocolate milk. Ethan got coffee and a piece of pie he didn't eat. She talked about something that happened in art class involving glue and someone named Marcus, who apparently had strong opinions about where the glue should go. Ethan listened and asked the right questions at the right times, and felt some of the tightness in his chest loosen, not all the way, but enough. "Dad," she said between bites, "are you okay?" "Getting there." "What happened?" He thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old. He thought about what she was old enough to understand and what she wasn't, and then he thought that she was probably older in certain ways than he gave her credit for. "Somebody at a bank treated me badly today," he said, "because of the way I look." She considered this. "Like your jacket?" "Like my jacket, my boots. The way I carry myself." She decided something about me before I said a word. Mia chewed her sandwich and thought about this with the gravity that children sometimes bring to things adults have stopped fully seeing. "That's not fair." "No, it isn't." "What did you do?" "I waited. And then the right people showed up and found out what happened." "Did she get in trouble?" "Yes." Good, Mia said, without particular venom. Just a statement of appropriate consequence, clean and simple. Then she drank her chocolate milk and moved back to Marcus and the glue situation, and Ethan sat across from her and drank his coffee and thought that some things were actually that simple, and he'd spent most of his adult life forgetting it. That night, after Mia was in bed, he called Sandra. "The video's at 400,000 views," she said, before he could say anything else. "I know, I saw. 3 journalists have called my office. 2 local, 1 national. I haven't called any of them back." A pause. "Should I?" "Not yet. Ethan, you have significant leverage right now. The video, the footage Calvin secured, my documentation of their procedural violations if we move forward with litigations." "Sandra, I know what you're going to say. Then let me say it anyway. I don't want to litigate this. I want to sit across from their compliance team and their HR people and Adrian Brooks and make them build something that works for the next person who walks into that branch." Pause. "That is a significantly less lucrative approach." "I know. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying know what you're trading." "I know what I'm trading." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, which with Sandra had an almost audible quality, like a very precise engine running at low speed. "Okay," she said finally. "Then let me structure the meeting so we're not just sitting there accepting whatever they offer. We go in with specific demands, documented, signed commitments with timelines and consequences. Not a press release and a promise. That's what I want. I'll draft the framework tonight." Another pause. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is right. I also think it's going to be harder than you expect. Most things are." They hung up. Ethan sat at his kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house after Mia was asleep. He could hear the refrigerator, a car passing outside, particular silence of a house that used to have more people in it. He thought about the meeting. He thought about Adrian Brooks and whether he was a man who kept his word or a man who was good at sounding like one. He thought about Nora Bennett, who he'd barely exchanged 20 words with, but who he'd watched all morning making careful small decisions at her workstation. He thought about Calvin Reed in the security room and the image of a cursor hovering over a delete function. He thought about Celeste Warren, not with satisfaction. He was honest enough with himself to recognize that what he felt about her was complicated in a way he hadn't expected. There was anger, still a clean, justified anger that he wasn't going to pretend wasn't there. But there was also something else, something that annoyed him a little because it complicated the narrative. She wasn't a villain who'd spent the morning twirling her mustache. She was a woman who had made a fast, ugly decision based on a reflex she probably didn't even fully see in herself, and then compounded it catastrophically by trying to make it disappear. That didn't make it better, but it made it more true. The truth was rarely as clean as the anger wanted it to be. He went to bed at 11. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. The meeting happened 6 days later. It was held at the regional office, not the branch a deliberate choice that Adrian had offered, and Sandra had accepted because it created a neutral space with the right participants. The room was a conference room on the 14th floor with a long table and a view of the city that would have been impressive to someone who wasn't coming in with a specific agenda. On Ethan's side of the table, Ethan himself, Sandra Park, and at Sandra's insistence a policy consultant named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had spent 20 years working on consumer protection frameworks for financial institutions and had opinions about most things and was not particularly interested in softening them. On the bank side, Adrian Brooks, the general counsel whose name was Peter Galveston and who had the careful, precise manner of someone who had spent decades making sure institutions didn't say things they couldn't take back. A woman named Joyce Terrell from HR and compliance, and a younger man whose role was apparently to take detailed notes and look uncomfortable. They spent the first hour going through what had happened. Galveston had clearly prepared for this. He had documentation, timelines, procedural breakdowns. He walked through each violation with the brisk efficiency of someone getting to the part where we talk about what we're going to do about it. Ethan let him. Sandra interjected twice, both times to clarify something that Galveston had described in language that was technically accurate but directionally misleading. He accepted both corrections without visible irritation, which told Ethan he'd dealt with Sandra Park before or people very much like her. Then Galveston slid a document across the table. "We'd like to begin with the remediation offer," he said. A replacement check will be issued within 48 hours. We've already been in contact with Vantage Holdings, and their CFO has agreed to cancel the original and reissue. Additionally, the bank is prepared to offer a settlement for. We're not here for the settlement number, Sandra said. Galveston paused. Mr. Cole's financial remediation is not in question. We'll get there. What we're here for first are the structural changes. She opened her own folder and slid a document across to Galveston. We've prepared a set of requirements. Galveston picked it up. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved quickly over the first page, then slowed on the second. Adrian Brooks had his own copy. Sandra had sent it the night before, and he was reading it with the focused attention of someone who had read it twice already and was reading it again to make sure his memory of it was accurate. Dr. Webb leaned forward, slightly. I'll walk you through the framework if that's helpful. Galveston looked at him. Please. Webb had the manner of a professor who had stopped caring what people thought of his directness sometime in his late 40s and hadn't looked back. The document outlines 4 categories of change. First, an independent audit of service delivery practices across all Meridian First National branches, conducted by a third-party firm with no prior relationship with the bank. The audit will specifically examine patterns in how customers are directed, delayed, or denied service, with demographic data where available. Joyce Terrell from HR shifted in her chair. That's a very broad scope. It is, Webb agreed. That's intentional. You can't fix what you haven't honestly measured. The cost of that kind of audit is considerably less than what a class action discovery process would cost, Sandra said pleasantly. Terrell glanced at Galveston. He gave her a look that said, let them finish. Webb continued. Second category, mandatory staff training. Not a half-day workshop. Not an online module people click through in 12 minutes. A structured, multi-session program with external facilitators on implicit bias in service delivery, specifically designed for customer-facing roles. Completion tracked, with follow-up sessions at 6 and 12 months. We have existing training programs, Terrell said. I've reviewed your existing programs, Webb said. They address procedural compliance. They don't address the kind of judgment call that happened last Tuesday morning. He said it without accusation, just observation. What happened in that lobby wasn't a policy gap. It was a decision made by a person operating on assumptions that your current training doesn't challenge. Terrell didn't respond to that. Third, Webb went on, an independent customer complaint pathway. Not the current internal process, which routes through branch management and has no external accountability. A dedicated ombudsperson function, ideally contracted externally, where customers can report service concerns directly, with guaranteed response timelines and documented outcomes that are reported quarterly to the board. Galveston set the document down. That would require significant structural changes to our compliance architecture. Yes, Webb said, it would. A silence. Ethan, who hadn't spoken since the opening, watched Adrian Brooks across the table. Adrian was looking at the document with an expression that was hard to read, not resistant, not enthusiastic. Thoughtful, in the way that people are thoughtful when something is costing them something real, and they're deciding whether the cost is right. And the fourth category? Galveston asked. Community investment, Webb said. The branch on Halsted and 3rd serves a mixed-income neighborhood. The bank's visible presence in that community has historically skewed toward higher-income customers. We're asking for a specific funded initiative, not a donation, not a sponsorship, a functional program. Financial literacy resources, accessible banking services for customers who don't have the account history or documentation that standard services require, staffed by people who are actually trained for that population. Galveston looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. The look between them was brief but complete, the kind of communication that happens between people who have worked together long enough to have a shorthand. Adrian turned to Ethan. Can I ask you something directly? Go ahead. Why not litigation? You'd win. The footage, the video, the documentation from your attorney and from Calvin Reed and from the employee who filed the internal complaint, you'd win, and you'd win significantly. Ethan looked at him. You want to know if I'm leaving money on the table because I don't know what I have? No. I think you know exactly what you have. Adrian paused. I want to understand the decision. Ethan thought about how he'd answered this for Sandra, and how he'd tried to explain it to Mia in a diner with a laminated menu. He thought about his father's jaw and the hardware store advertisement on the concrete wall. None of those things were things he was going to say in this conference room. Because I've been in that branch since I was 28 years old, he said instead. I opened my first business account there 3 months after my father died with $11,000 and no idea what I was doing. I've had 3 different loans through that branch. I've been a customer of that institution for 15 years. He looked at Adrian. I'm not trying to burn it down. I'm trying to make it worth what I put into it. The room was quiet for a moment. That's a more generous position than I expected, Adrian said. I'm aware. Adrian looked down at the document in front of him. He looked at Peter Galveston. Something passed between them again. Then Adrian put both hands flat on the table, a gesture that Ethan recognized as the gesture of a person who has made a decision and is about to make it known. The audit, Adrian said. We'll do it. External firm, clean scope, no interference from our side. He glanced at Galveston, who nodded once carefully. The training, yes. We'll need to discuss the specifics with HR, but the framework is acceptable. The community initiative, yes. We've been discussing something in that direction internally, and this gives it a reason to actually happen instead of staying in a planning document forever. He paused. The ombudsperson function is the hardest. That's a structural change that goes above my authority to approve in this room today. What level does it need to go to? Sandra asked. The board. Then we'd like a timeline for board presentation and a written commitment that you'll advocate for it. Galveston made a note. We can provide a written commitment with a 30-day timeline for board presentation. 20, Sandra said. Another look between Galveston and Adrian. 25, Galveston said. Sandra looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded. Fine, she said. There was more after that language around the settlement, timelines, documentation requirements, a discussion about the press statement that took 40 minutes because every word mattered, and several of them mattered more than others. By the time they were done, it was after 2 in the afternoon, and the view from the 14th floor had gone from clear to overcast, which felt appropriate. People were gathering their things. Joyce Terrell approached Ethan. She'd been relatively quiet for the back half of the meeting, listening, noting, occasionally asking a clarifying question. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, had the look of someone who had worked in HR long enough to have seen almost everything, and had stopped being surprised by most of it, but not all of it. Mr. Cole, she said, I want to ask about Nora Bennett. Ethan looked at her. What about her? She filed an internal complaint the morning of the incident. Before anyone had contacted corporate, before the video was circulating, Terrell paused. She documented everything she witnessed, in real time, and submitted it through the official channel. It was the first documentation we received. Another pause. I wanted you to know that. Ethan thought about Nora at her workstation. Stillness of her, the way she'd kept working while watching everything, and the way that working had apparently meant 2 things at once. What happens to her, he asked. Nothing negative, Terrell said. We're actually considering whether there's a role for her in helping design the new complaint procedures. Her instinct to document the specific way she did it is exactly what those procedures should produce. She paused again, seeming to weigh something. I wanted you to know because the story that's out there, and the story that'll come out of our communications, the names people know are yours, and Celeste Warren's and Adrian's. People in the middle tend to disappear. I know, Ethan said. I thought you might. She went back to gathering her things. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then he looked over at Calvin Reed's photograph that was not in this room, because Calvin was at his post on Halsted and 3rd, doing what he did every day, and would probably be doing it again tomorrow. Outside on the street, Ethan and Sandra stood on the sidewalk while the November wind did what November wind does. That went better than I expected, Sandra said, though I want to see everything in writing before I say that with confidence. You'll get it in writing. I always want it in writing. She tucked her folder under her arm. How do you feel? He thought about it honestly. Tired. And okay. That tracks. She looked at him. For what it's worth what you did in there. Turning down what you could have had to ask for what you actually wanted that took something. Not everyone has that thing. I had a good example, he said. She didn't ask what he meant by that. She just nodded, said she'd send him the final agreement language by Thursday, and walked to her car. Ethan stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. The city moved around him, people traffic, the ordinary urgent motion of a Tuesday afternoon that had no idea what had happened in the room 14 floors above it. He thought about Mia, who would be getting out of school in about 40 minutes. He thought about the diner and the chocolate milk and the completely reasonable way she'd said that's not fair and moved on. He started walking to his car. Behind him, through the glass lobby of the building, he could see the elevator doors close on Adrian Brooks and Peter Galveston, still talking, their voices already working through the next thing. The process had started. Whether it would hold, whether the signed commitments would produce real change or find their way into a drawer somewhere, was a question that didn't have an answer today. But it had started, and that was different from where things had been a week ago. Ethan Cole turned his collar up against the wind and kept walking. The agreement arrived on Thursday, as Sandra had promised. It was 43 pages, which was about 38 more pages than Ethan had expected, and he read all of it at the kitchen table after Mia went to bed. With a glass of water he kept forgetting to drink, and a pen he used to mark 4 places where the language was softer than what had been discussed in the room. He sent the marked pages to Sandra at 11:15. She responded at 11:17, which meant she'd been waiting, and her message said, "I saw those too. Already drafted the revisions. We'll send to Galveston first thing tomorrow." He put the phone down and sat there a little longer than he needed to. The house was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that accumulates in a house where someone used to be and isn't anymore, not oppressive, not dramatic, just present. A particular frequency of silence that Ethan had gotten used to over 2 years and still noticed sometimes at night when the day was finally done, and there was nothing left to keep his attention pointed outward. He thought about whether he'd done the right thing. Not in the meeting, he felt reasonably solid about the meeting, but in the whole shape of the decision. The road not taken, as Sandra had carefully refrained from calling it, was still visible from where he stood. A significant litigation settlement. His name attached to a lawsuit that would have generated coverage, pressure, a different kind of change. He'd have won. She'd told him that plainly, and she was not someone who said things plainly unless she meant them. He'd chosen something else. He was still choosing it. Every day the process moved forward. He wasn't certain it was right. He was certain it was his. That was going to have to be enough for now. Sandra got the revisions back from Galveston by Friday afternoon. 2 of Ethan's 4 flagged items were accepted as written. 1 was negotiated to a middle position that was acceptable. The 4th, a clause about the timeline for the Ombudsperson Board presentation, stayed at 25 days rather than the 20 Sandra had pushed for, which she had already told him was a fight she'd picked tactically and was fine losing. The agreement was signed the following Monday. Both parties. No press conference, no photographs, no staged moment. Just signatures scanned and emailed, in a transaction that was thoroughly undramatic for something that had taken 3 weeks and a great deal out of several people. Adrian Brooks called Ethan directly afterward. "It's done," he said. "I know. Sandra sent me the final pages an hour ago. I wanted to call anyway." A pause. "The audit firm starts next week. Joyce Terrell has already been in contact with the external training facilitators. She's more committed to this than I expected, honestly. She went and found specialists with specific experience in financial services, not just a generic implicit bias curriculum. Good. The community initiative has a project lead assigned. Her name is Donna Reyes. She came from a nonprofit background, worked in community banking access for 8 years. We were lucky she was available." Ethan noted the name. He'd want to meet Donna Reyes at some point, not to supervise, but to understand what was actually being built. There was a difference between a program that existed and a program that worked, and the difference usually lived in the specific person running it and whether they had actual authority or just a title. "What about Nora Bennett?" Ethan asked. A brief pause. "She's been offered a role on the new complaint pathway development team. Hybrid position, she keeps her teller responsibilities for now, but spends 20% of her time on policy work. She accepted yesterday. She'll be good at it." "I think so too." Another pause. This one had a different weight to it. "Calvin Reed," Adrian said. "Yeah, he's received a formal commendation. It'll be in his personnel file. He was also offered a promotion to senior security coordinator. It would move him off the floor into more of a supervisory role." Adrian paused. He turned it down. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He said he'd rather stay on the floor. "That's where the work is." A short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I respected it. Ethan respected it too. He understood it. Actually, the choice to stay in the place where you can see things directly, rather than moving to the position where you manage people who see them. Some people were built for one, some for the other. And the useful thing was knowing which one you were. And Celeste? Ethan asked. He'd been not asking it for 3 weeks and decided he was done not asking. Adrian's answer was measured. Her employment was terminated, formally, after the investigation concluded. The investigation found violations of bank policy and the service denial, the document destruction, and the attempted deletion of recorded footage. All 3 documented. He paused. She retained an attorney. There was a conversation about wrongful termination. It went nowhere. The documentation was thorough. Is she okay? A silence. Longer than the others. I honestly don't know, Adrian said. I haven't spoken with her since the day I put her on leave. I heard through HR that she's been not well. Not in a medical sense, just the fallout was significant. The video is still out there. It's been seen by a lot of people. Ethan stared at the window across the kitchen. The November light was doing its thin, pale thing, the way November light did in this part of the country, like it was already tired and the solstice hadn't even arrived yet. I didn't want to destroy her, he said. I know. The video, I didn't post it. I didn't call the press. I know, Ethan. Everyone who looked at the timeline knows that. Adrian paused. Some things, once they're in motion, are hard to stop. The woman who recorded it made her own decision. That decision had consequences that went past what anyone in that lobby intended. He paused again. That's not your responsibility. Ethan wasn't entirely sure he agreed with that. He also wasn't sure he disagreed. Responsibility had a way of spreading unevenly in situations like this, pooling in some places, absent from others, and rarely distributed in the proportions that felt right. All right, he said. Thank you for calling. Thank you for what you asked for, Adrian said, instead of what you could have taken. They hung up. Ethan sat at his kitchen table for a while. Then he got up and started making dinner. Because Mia would be home in an hour, and she had expressed very specific opinions about pasta this week, and he was not going to show up to that conversation unprepared. The months that followed were not a montage. They were not clean or fast or satisfying in the way that resolution is satisfying when you read about it later. And the timeline has been compressed. They were slow and incremental and full of small frustrations, and occasionally something happened that made Ethan think it might be working, and occasionally something happened that made him wonder. The audit firm, a group called Independent Compliance Partners out of Chicago, spent 6 weeks examining Meridian First National's service delivery patterns across all 14 branches in the region. Their report ran to 87 pages and found what Dr. Marcus Webb had expected it to find: not a culture of deliberate discrimination, but a consistent pattern of implicit prioritization that resulted in customers with lower income presentations being redirected to longer processes, offered fewer products, and denied service at statistically higher rates than their transaction histories would justify. The report was delivered to the bank's board in February. Adrian Brooks had told Ethan it was coming. Ethan had not expected to be sent a copy, but Adrian emailed it to him directly on the same day it went to the board, with a note that said simply, "This is what you asked for. You should see it." Ethan read all 87 pages. He sent a 2-sentence email back: "Thank you. Now fix it." The training program launched in March across all 14 branches. Nora Bennett was part of the team that piloted the curriculum she'd spent the winter working with the external facilitators, going through the material herself first and then helping adapt it for the specific rhythms of branch work. She'd pushed back on 2 sections that she felt were too abstract, too removed from the actual moment-by-moment decisions that happen at a counter window. The facilitators had listened to her, which she'd found genuinely surprising, and the final program reflected her revisions. She was still at her teller window 3 days a week. She decided she wanted to stay there, at least for now. Policy work mattered, but the window mattered too. It kept her honest about what she was designing, kept it connected to the actual texture of the work, rather than the idea of it. She thought about Ethan Cole sometimes, standing at the counter with his worn jacket and his stillness while the lobby processed what it had just seen. She thought about the decision she'd made that morning to open the document, to write it down, to submit it. She'd been scared when she hit the button. She'd been scared for about a week after. Nothing bad had happened. She was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that nothing bad had happened, because she'd spent a long time in this job operating on the assumption that the cost of saying something was always high. Maybe the cost was variable. Maybe it depended on who was in the room and whether the footage was locked and whether the person at the center of it asked for something worth building instead of something worth burning. Maybe it depended on a lot of things she was still figuring out. The Meridian Community Access Program, which was what Donna Reyes ended up calling it, after rejecting 3 more corporate-sounding names, opened its first location inside the Halstead and 3rd branch in April. It occupied a partitioned section near the back of the lobby, 2 dedicated workstations, printed materials in 4 languages, and a staff member present during all branch hours whose specific job was to help customers who needed more time, more explanation, or more patience than the standard service model provided. Donna Reyes had spent the winter building it from the ground up with what she described. When someone asked, as enough budget to do it right and enough bureaucracy to make doing it right take twice as long as it should. She had the blunt good humor of someone who had worked in systems long enough to find them funny without finding them acceptable. She had meetings with Adrian Brooks every 2 weeks and had told him in their 3rd meeting that if he wanted this to actually work, he needed to stop sending her to meetings with the facilities team and start sending the facilities team to meetings with her. He'd laughed. Then he'd done it. The program's first month saw 43 customers use its services customers who, by their own account, had previously avoided the branch or found the standard service process too difficult to navigate. By the 3rd month, that number was over 100. Donna kept track. She reported the numbers at every board meeting, with the context to make them meaningful, and she had a specific talent for framing data in ways that were impossible to dismiss as soft. The ombudsperson functioned the hardest of the 4 demands. The one that had required the board presentation and the 25-day timeline was approved in April and operational by June. Position went to an external contractor, a woman named Helen Park, who had no prior relationship with Meridian First National and had, in Sandra's words when she heard the hire, exactly the right kind of inconvenient independence. Helen Park's quarterly reports were filed with the board, and after Ethan asked, through Sandra and Adrian agreed, made available on the bank's public website in a format that was actually readable. The first quarterly report noted 12 complaints, 7 of which had been investigated and resolved, 3 of which were still under review, and 2 of which had been found outside the program's scope. The report used real language. It did not, as Ethan noticed when he read it, describe anything as having been handled to everyone's satisfaction. It described outcomes. That was the difference. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about any of this was perfect. The audit had found problems that would take years to fully address. The training program reached all the branches but had landed with wildly variable levels of engagement. Some branches took it seriously, and some treated it as a compliance exercise to be completed and filed. The complaint pathway had a backlog issue in its 3rd month that took 6 weeks to resolve. The community program was underfunded relative to what Donna needed, and she had said so in writing 3 times. And twice she'd gotten increases, and once she'd gotten a meeting about the process for requesting increases, which she had described in a later conversation with Ethan as a really beautiful example of institutional instinct. Ethan had laughed at that. He'd been meeting with Donna informally every 6 weeks or so, over coffee at a place near the branch. He didn't think of it as oversight. It wasn't his program to oversee. He thought of it as staying honest, staying connected to whether the thing he'd asked for was the thing that was actually being built. Mostly it was. Not always, but mostly. And mostly, it turned out, was considerably better than it had been before. In July, 7 months after the morning with the check, Ethan Cole walked into the Meridian First National branch on Halstead and 3rd for the first time since he'd walked out of it. He hadn't planned it as a significant moment. He had a routine transaction he needed to update some account information, and Sandra had told him it was easier to do in person than over the phone. He'd come in on a Thursday afternoon wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt because it was July, and he'd been at a site inspection that morning, and he hadn't gone home to change. The branch looked the same. The polished floors, the teller windows, the coffee station that nobody used, the low leather chairs by the window where he'd sat for 2.5 hours on a November Tuesday with 2 halves of a check in his shirt pocket. He noticed 2 things immediately. The partition at the back of the lobby, where the Community Access Program workstation was, had a customer at it, an older man in work clothes, probably late 60s, sitting across from one of Donna's staff members with a set of documents spread on the table between them. Staff member was leaning forward slightly, listening and pointing at something on a form. Unhurried. Patient. Like this conversation was the one thing she was here to have. The second thing he noticed was at the teller windows. A woman had come in ahead of him. He'd been behind her in the short line outside. She was maybe 50, wearing a house cleaner's uniform, the kind with the company logo on the breast pocket, and carrying a canvas bag with some papers in it. She stepped up to window 2, which was staffed by a teller Ethan didn't recognize, and she said something he couldn't hear from where he was standing. The teller looked at her documents, asked a question. The woman answered. The teller nodded, said something back, and started processing whatever it was. No hesitation, no long look up and down, no recalibration. Just the transaction, handled by two people engaged in the ordinary and unremarkable business of a bank doing its job. Ethan stood in the lobby and watched this for a moment longer than he needed to. He wasn't naive about what he was seeing. One transaction at one window didn't mean the pattern identified in 87 pages of audit findings had been resolved. The training had reached some people and bounced off others. The culture of any institution changes slowly and unevenly and always resists more than it yields. He knew all of that. But the woman in the house cleaner's uniform was standing at the window and getting helped without an incident, without the particular quality of delay that is its own kind of answer. And that was something. That was not nothing. He stepped up to the next available window. The teller was young. Someone knew he didn't recognize her. She looked at him with the routine professional attention of a person at work. Good afternoon. How can I help you? I need to update some account information, he said. Business account. Of course. She pulled up the screen. Can I get your account number or the name on the account? Ethan Cole. She typed it in, looked at the screen, then looked up at him with a slight change of expression, not dramatic, just a recognition of something. Mr. Cole, she said. One moment. She stepped away from the window. He felt a brief, old reflex, the one from November, the one that knew what it felt like when a teller walked away from the window and what happened next. He recognized it, noted it, and let it sit there without doing anything with it. She came back with a second person, not a manager in a power suit, just another staff member, someone from the account services team. Hi, Mr. Cole, the second person said. I can help you directly with the account update. We have some new authorization options that might actually simplify things for your business accounts if you want to go over those while you're here. Sure, Ethan said. They went to a small table off to the side. The process took about 20 minutes. The staff member knew what she was doing, answered his questions without making him feel like the questions were inconvenient, and at one point flagged a feature he hadn't known existed that was actually going to save him about 40 minutes a month in reconciliation work. It was not a profound interaction. It was just competent, respectful service, the kind that should have been unremarkable. The fact that he noticed it said something he was still working out how to feel about. Calvin Reed was at his post near the entrance. He'd been there when Ethan walked in and had given him a nod of recognition, quiet, brief, the same way Calvin did most things. When Ethan finished at the table and walked toward the exit, Calvin was still there. Ethan stopped. Calvin, Mr. Cole, how are things? Calvin looked around the lobby with the measured attention of someone who saw it freshly every day even after years of seeing it. Better than they were, he said. You turned down that promotion. Calvin looked at him. You heard about that. Adrian mentioned it. Yeah. He looked back at the lobby. This is where things happen. The office is where you hear about things after they happened. A pause. I'd rather be here. Ethan nodded. He understood that completely. Take care of yourself, he said. You too. He walked out through the glass doors into the July heat, which was the opposite of November in every way, except that the street outside was still the same street, still indifferent, still doing what streets do, regardless of what's happening inside the buildings along them. He sat in his car for a few minutes, not because he was processing anything dramatic, he wasn't. He was just sitting, doing what he'd done in November without the weight of what November had been. Just a man in a car on a Thursday afternoon, done with an errand, not yet going anywhere. He thought about his father. He thought about the hardware store advertisement on the concrete wall. He thought about a lot of things that didn't resolve into clean conclusions because real things rarely did. What he'd done the whole arc of it, from staying in that lobby to sitting across from Adrian Brooks to asking for policies instead of a payout, wasn't heroic. He knew that. He'd been scared and tired and angry in measures that didn't fit the version of the story that was still circulating online. In the comments where people called him wise and patient and principled. He had been those things sometimes. He'd also been petty and exhausted, and there were moments in the process where he'd wanted to take the money and be done with it and never set foot in that branch again. He'd chosen differently. Not because he was better than the anger, because he was thinking about Mia, who had said that's not fair and moved on. The way kids move on, with the assumption that adults would handle it. He was thinking about his father, who had handled things quietly for 31 years and left Ethan a piece of land and a particular set to the jaw. He was thinking about the next person who would walk into that branch in worn clothes with something legitimate in their pocket, and whether that person would have to do what he'd done or whether they'd just be helped. That was the thing, in the end. Not the $5 million, which was real money, and had changed practical things in his life and Mia's, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Not the vindication, which had felt like something for about 48 hours and then settled into something quieter and harder to name. Not even the changes at the bank, which were real and partial and ongoing and not guaranteed to last. It was the woman in the house cleaner's uniform at window 2, unhurried, unquestioned, getting helped. That was it. That was the thing he'd been trying to make happen. And it had happened today, in an ordinary Thursday lobby, in a transaction so unremarkable that nobody in the branch would remember it by the time they went home. That was exactly right. He started the car. He had to pick up Mia from her summer program. She was doing a 4-week art class, which had been her idea, and which had produced a series of paintings that Ethan privately thought were better than anything a 7-year-old had any business making. He was going to be 5 minutes late if he didn't go now. He pulled out of the parking lot. He thought, not for the first time, that dignity was a strange thing to have to fight for. It shouldn't require a $5 million check to prove you deserved basic respect. It shouldn't require 2.5 hours in a lobby and a lawyer and a 43-page agreement and 6 months of institutional process. It shouldn't require anything at all, because it wasn't supposed to be conditional on what you wore or what you carried or what the number in your account was at this particular moment. That was the thing people forgot. Not because they were bad, most people weren't bad, but because systems didn't fix themselves, and habits didn't change without pressure. And the people who needed things to change were usually the people with the least power to make them change. And the people with the most power to change things usually didn't experience them as broken. Ethan had been in a specific position that specific morning. He'd had something in his pocket that gave him a kind of leverage most people didn't have. He was aware of that. He was aware that the story would have been different, unrecorded, unresolved, absorbed into the long accumulation of small indignities that people carry and don't talk about if the check had been for $800. If no one had had a phone out, if Calvin Reed had been someone else. He couldn't fix all of that. He was one person who had been in one lobby on one morning and had made a set of choices about what to do next. He'd made the choices he had access to. That was what anyone could do. In any situation, make the choices you have access to, as honestly as you can, and try not to fool yourself about which ones are really about principle and which ones are about something smaller. He wasn't sure he'd always gotten that right. He was pretty sure he'd mostly gotten it right. Mostly again. That word, he'd take mostly. Mostly was honest. Mostly was what people actually achieved when they were trying and not lying to themselves about it. Perfection was a thing that existed in press releases and closing arguments, and Ethan Cole had never had much use for either. He pulled into the parking lot of the community center where Mia's art class met. He was 3 minutes late. He could see her through the glass door. She was talking to another kid with the animated specificity of someone making a very important point, and she had paint on her left arm up to the elbow, which was going to be a conversation. She saw him and her face did the thing it did, that uncomplicated brightness, the particular light that was just for him, that he was aware he didn't deserve as cleanly as she gave it, and that he intended to spend a long time trying to deserve better. She grabbed her backpack and her rolled-up painting and came out through the door. "You're late," she said. 3 minutes. That's still late. You're right. I'm sorry. She looked at him with the evaluating gaze she'd been developing lately, the one that meant she was deciding whether the apology was adequate. She decided it was. "What's that?" she asked, nodding at his face. "What's what?" "You look like you're thinking about something." He looked at her. The paint on her arm, the uneven braids, she'd done them herself this morning and insisted they were fine. The way she stood with her backpack hitched on one shoulder, looking up at him like he was a person worth figuring out. "I went to the bank today," he said. "The one from before?" "Yeah. And?" He thought about the woman at window 2. The ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable transaction. The thing that shouldn't have to be a victory and was won anyway. And it was okay, he said. It was just okay. She considered this. Good okay or regular okay? Good okay, he said. She nodded like that, settled something. Then she showed him the painting it was of a house, their house, with the tree in the front yard that had lost 2 branches in last year's windstorm and hadn't quite recovered its shape. She'd painted it crooked, with the sky a color that wasn't quite any real sky color, but was somehow exactly right. Put you in it, she said, pointing to a small figure standing by the tree. The figure had a jacket on. It was standing still, looking at something that wasn't in the frame. That's me, he said. That's you. He looked at it for a long time. The crooked house, the almost right sky, the small figure in the jacket, looking at something outside the edge of the painting. He rolled it back up carefully and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. Let's go home, he said. They walked to the car together. She told him about the paint and Marcus from art class, who had apparently transferred from her school and was now in her summer program and still had strong opinions about things that didn't require opinions. Ethan listened and asked the right questions and felt the day settle into something he could carry without it being heavy. Some things you fight for and win outright. Some things you fight for and get something close to what you wanted and spend a long time deciding if close is enough. Some things you fight for, and the fighting changes you before you ever see a result. And the result, when it comes, is quieter than you expected and harder to hold in your hands. Ethan Cole had a painting of a crooked house and a kid who put paint on herself up to the elbow and a piece of land on Route 9 that had become something, finally, after a very long time. And somewhere in the Halsted and 3rd branch of Meridian First National Bank, an ordinary Thursday afternoon was finishing itself out transactions processing, the door opening and closing, coffee station humming, and nobody in it was being asked to prove they deserved to be there. That was enough. Not everything. Not clean. Not fixed forever. But enough. Ethan drove home the long way. Not because he was avoiding anything there was nothing to avoid today, which was itself a thing worth noticing, but because the long way took him past Route 9, the stretch of road where the coal industrial property had been, and he wanted to see it. He hadn't been out that way in a while. Since the sale closed, he'd stayed away mostly, the way you stay away from a place that held a long chapter of your life, and you're not yet sure how to be around it now that the chapter is done. Mia was in the back seat, still talking about Marcus, who had apparently graduated from the glue incident to a new controversy involving the proper way to clean brushes. Ethan made the right sounds at the right intervals and watched the neighborhood change as they moved east, the commercial blocks giving way to the older industrial stretch, the buildings getting lower and farther apart, the road surface getting rougher in the way of roads that the city maintained last and replaced never. He slowed when he got to where the property had been. It wasn't empty anymore. The sale had closed 9 months ago, and Vantage Holdings had been moving fast. The chain-link fence that had surrounded the acreage for the last decade was gone, replaced by construction hoarding with architectural renderings printed on it in the colors of a company that was very confident about its future. He could see the foundation work through the gaps. Steel and concrete, the early skeleton of something that would eventually be mixed-use commercial space, retail below and offices above, the kind of development that Route 9 had been zoned for since before Ethan was born. His grandfather had bought that land in 1961 for $12,000, had paid cash, which was the only way a man like his grandfather could buy anything in 1906 in this town, had held on to it through decades that gave him plenty of reasons to sell, and a stubbornness that was both his best and most infuriating quality, had passed it to Ethan's father, who'd passed it to Ethan, who had spent 6 years and 14 months of negotiations and one dropped lawsuit, turning it into something that could actually move forward. $12,000 in 1961. $5 million in November. 63 years. Dad, why'd we stop? Just looking. Mia pressed her face against the window. What is it? Used to be our land. She looked at it for a moment, the construction, hoarding, the renderings, the faint sound of machinery from somewhere behind the boards. What's it going to be? Buildings, stores, offices, probably. That's boring. He almost laughed. Yeah, it kind of is. She went back to her backpack, looking for something. He watched the construction site for another minute. He wasn't sentimental about it, or he was, a little, but not in a paralyzing way. His grandfather had bought that land, so it could eventually become something, and it was becoming something. That was the whole story. The specifics of what it was becoming were less important than the fact that it was, finally, going somewhere. He pulled back onto the road and drove home. The house needed work. It had needed work since he bought it 7 years ago, and the work had been happening in the slow, interrupted way of a single person managing a house and a child and a business simultaneously, one room done properly, 2 rooms functioning but not finished. The back porch in a state of permanent, not quite renovation that Mia had at some point decided was a feature and had arranged some of her outdoor toys around accordingly. Now he had money, real money, the kind that changed what was possible, and he was still getting used to what that meant. He'd paid off the mortgage in January, established college funds that were not going to cover everything, but were going to cover enough. Put a significant amount into accounts that his financial advisor, a careful woman named Paulette, who had the manner of someone who had seen people come into money and make bad decisions enough times to be very deliberate about her. Guidance had helped him structure for the long term. He was not going to do something foolish with it. He was also not going to treat it like it wasn't there. He'd started, slowly, thinking about the back porch. That evening, after dinner, after Mia was bathed and in bed with a book she was allegedly reading, but was actually looking at the pictures of, Ethan sat on the back porch in the state of permanent, not quite renovation and called his sister. Her name was Diane, and she lived in Atlanta, and she was 2 years older than him and had her mother's practical directness and their father's stubbornness, and a life that was completely different from his, and they talked every couple of weeks, usually for longer than either of them intended. "How'd it go?" she asked. She knew he'd gone to the branch today. He'd told her he was planning to, because Diane was one of those people who needed to know plans in advance in order not to worry, and Ethan tried to give her that when he could. "It was fine," he said. "Better than fine. Normal. Normal's good. Normal is exactly what I wanted." She was quiet for a moment. "You sound different." "Different how?" "Lighter, maybe. I don't know." He could hear her moving around her kitchen, the sound of dishes being put away. "You've been carrying that thing for a long time." 7 months. I mean the other thing. The land. The deal. All of it. He thought about that. She wasn't wrong. He'd been carrying some version of the Route 9 weight for years, the responsibility of it, the complicated history of it, the pressure of making something work that 2 people before him had preserved at their own cost. The sale had ended that, but endings had their own weight. You didn't just set something down and feel light. You felt the absence of the weight, which was different, and took some getting used to. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe. How's Mia?" She got paint on herself up to the elbow. Diane laughed. "She's going to be an artist. She's 7. So?" He looked at the back porch, the boards that needed replacing, the railing that leaned slightly south, the collection of Mia's outdoor toys arranged with inexplicable logic around the one section of floor that was completely sound. "I'm going to fix up the house," he said. "About time. The back porch first, then the kitchen. What about the upstairs bathroom? What about it? It's been on your list for 3 years, Ethan. Porch first, then the kitchen, then we'll talk about the bathroom." She made a sound that communicated her position on the bathroom timeline without requiring further words about it. "Then are you okay?" Really. He thought about the woman at window 2, the painting of the crooked house, the ordinary Thursday that had turned out to be something he wanted to remember without quite knowing why. "Yeah," he said, "I am. Good. Another dish going somewhere. Dad would have gotten a kick out of all of this. The check, the bank, the whole thing. He would have told me not to wear that jacket." Diane laughed again, louder this time. "He absolutely would have. He would have said you're going to deposit $5 million and you wore that? It's a good jacket. It has a torn pocket. The pocket still works." "Ethan, the structural integrity of the pocket is fine, Diane." She was laughing, and he was almost laughing, and the back porch was what it was, and the evening air was warm, and his daughter was upstairs looking at book pictures, and his father had been dead for 7 years and was still very present in specific moments, which was how it worked with people you loved. They didn't go away. They just stopped being audible and stayed visible if you knew where to look. They talked for another 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with banks or checks or any of it, Diane's job, her kids, a trip she was planning for the fall, The situation with their aunt in Cleveland that had been an ongoing situation since approximately 2019 and showed no signs of resolution. By the time they hung up, it was past 9 and the air had cooled, and he sat on the porch for a while longer in the quiet, not thinking about much, just sitting. This was the part nobody saw. This was the part that didn't make it into the version of the story that had circulated online for 7 months, that had been shared and commented on, and turned into a dozen different morality plays, depending on what the person sharing it needed it to mean. The actual texture of it was this: a man sitting on a back porch that needed work, in a house that needed more work, in a life that was genuinely better than it had been a year ago, and was still imperfect in the specific ways that lives are imperfect when you're raising a child alone and working through what you want the next chapter to look like. There was no clean ending to sit in. There was just the next day, and the day after that, and the slow accumulation of choices about what kind of person you were going to keep being. He was working on it. 2 weeks after the branch visit, Ethan got a letter. It wasn't email, an actual letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed in careful script. The return address was a street in the suburb east of town, a residential address he didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen table while Mia was eating breakfast. The handwriting was precise and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write in a different era and had maintained the habit. It read, "Mr. Cole, my name is Patricia Odom. You don't know me. I was in the lobby of the Meridian First National branch on Halstead and 3rd on the morning of November 12th. I had just finished a transaction and was putting my things in my bag when you came to the counter. I watched what happened. I am 71 years old, and I have seen a lot of things in banks, and I have mostly kept quiet about them because I did not think it would help. I want you to know that I have thought about what you did after not just that morning, but all of it, what I read about later many times. I think you made the right choices. I also think they were hard choices. I wanted someone to tell you that who wasn't a lawyer or a newspaper. I hope you and your daughter are well. Patricia Odom." Ethan read it twice, then he set it down on the table. "What's that?" Mia asked, without looking up from her cereal. "A letter from someone who was there, the day at the bank. What's it say?" "That she was watching, and that she thinks things turned out okay." Mia considered this. "That's nice." "Yeah," he said. "It is." He wrote back that afternoon. He wasn't someone who wrote letters. Usually his communication ran to texts and the occasional email, but this had come in a form that asked for the same form back. He thanked her. He told her that he hadn't known anyone like her was in the lobby that day, and that knowing it now meant something. He told her Mia was well and driving him crazy in the specific and necessary way that 7-year-olds were supposed to. He sealed it and walked it to the mailbox himself rather than leaving it for pickup, which felt like the right thing to do for reasons he didn't fully examine. He thought about Patricia Odom for a few days after that. 71 years old, had seen things in banks, had mostly kept quiet. He thought about how long that was a lifetime of watching things happen in lobbies and offices and across counters, and making the calculation every time that speaking wouldn't help. He understood that calculation. He had made versions of it himself in other rooms at other times. Most people had. The thing that changed the calculation was usually not courage in the abstract. It was usually something specific, a particular moment, where the cost of staying quiet finally outweighed the cost of saying something, or where the possibility that it might actually matter crossed some threshold and you moved before you could think yourself out of it. Nora Bennett had had that moment at her workstation. Calvin Reed had had it in the doorway of the security room. Patricia Odom apparently had been watching and carrying it quietly for 7 months and had reached for a pen. These were not dramatic acts. They were small, specific human ones. They were the kind that didn't end up in the story that circulated online, but were in some ways the actual story. He wasn't sure he'd ever found a clean way to say that. He wasn't sure there was one. In September, Marcus Webb, the policy consultant who had sat across from Peter Galveston in the regional office conference room and described 4 categories of required change with the directness of a man who had stopped softening things sometime in his late 40s, published an article in a professional journal about the Meridian First National case. He didn't use Ethan's name, or Celeste Warren's, or anyone else's. He used the bank's name because it was part of the public record, and there was no avoiding it. But the people were described in their roles only. The article was about what he called the gap between institutional compliance and institutional culture, the difference between a bank that had policies against discriminatory service delivery, and a bank where nobody actually thought twice before tearing a check in half based on a jacket. He argued, with the careful specificity of someone making a case in front of an audience of skeptics, that the gap was not filled by training alone or by audits alone or by complaint pathways alone, but by the slow accumulation of smaller decisions, the Calvin Reeds who said on what grounds, the Nora Bennetts who opened a document and started typing, the customers who stayed in their chairs when they could have left. He sent Ethan a copy with a note that said, "You should know this exists. You don't have to read it." Ethan read it. He didn't agree with every word. There was a section in the middle that felt too optimistic about institutional self-correction, too willing to assume that the mechanisms they'd built at Meridian would hold without sustained pressure. He thought about emailing Webb about it and decided against it. The man was making a case in a specific format for a specific audience, and the case was mostly right. Ethan was not the audience. He put the article in the same drawer where he kept Patricia Odom's letter. By October, the Community Access Program had served over 400 customers. Donna Reyes sent him the number in a text with a single line underneath it, "We need more space." He texted back, "Tell Adrian." She texted, "I did." He said he'd look at the floor plan. He texted, "Tell him again." She sent a thumbs up. He liked Donna Reyes. She had the useful quality of being completely uninterested in credit and completely interested in results, which was rarer than it should have been. She sent him updates, not because anyone had told her to, but because she decided he was a useful person to keep informed. And she didn't frame them as reports, just texts, usually brief, sometimes including a specific detail that she found interesting or frustrating or worth noting. Had a customer today who'd been avoiding banks for 6 years. First transaction in 6 years. Took an hour. Worth it. Or, the facilities team moved our appointment scheduling board 3 times in 2 weeks. I put it back each time. We're in a standoff. He texted back when he had something useful to say and didn't when he didn't. It was a functional, working relationship between 2 people who had both decided the thing was worth their time, which was pretty much what all good working relationships were at their core. In November, on the 1-year anniversary of the morning with the check, Ethan did not do anything ceremonial. There was no moment of reflection he'd planned, no visit to the branch to mark the occasion. He took Mia to school. He had a call with a contractor about the kitchen renovation, which was finally in progress. And the call went long because there were decisions to make about cabinet hardware that Ethan had not anticipated needing opinions about and discovered he had opinions about anyway. He ate lunch at his desk. He reviewed some documents for a smaller property deal he was considering, a commercial space on the west side of town that a friend had told him about. Nothing as significant as Route 9, but something interesting. At about 3 in the afternoon, Sandra Park texted him, 1 year. "How are you?" He typed back, "Fine. Good, how are you?" She replied, billing hourly, as always. Seriously, though. He thought about it. Typed, "I think we did the right thing." She replied after a moment, "I know we did. I just wanted to hear you say it." He put the phone down and went back to the property documents and didn't think about it again until he was picking up Mia, who had paint on herself again, a different arm this time, which he chose to interpret as growth, and who wanted to stop at the library on the way home because she needed a specific book about horses that she had decided was an urgent requirement. They stopped at the library. It took 45 minutes because Mia found several other books that were also urgent requirements. They came home with 6 books, only one of which was about horses. He made dinner. She did her reading. He fixed a small thing on the back porch, a board he'd been meaning to address for 2 weeks, and stood back and looked at it and decided it was level enough and moved on. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and thought about what a year was. Not this year specifically, the specific year had its specific events. The check, the lobby, the meeting, the agreement, all of it. But a year as a unit of time. Enough time for things to change and for the change to start to feel like normal, which was how you knew it was real. Things that felt like events eventually became things that were just true. The audit had happened, and its findings were being addressed. The program existed and was growing. The complaint pathway was operational. Nora Bennett went to work every Tuesday doing 2 things at once. Calvin Reed stood at his post where the work was. These things were true now. They'd become true slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and bureaucratic friction, and at least one extended standoff over a scheduling board. They were not going to be unmade tomorrow. They might erode over time. Institutions always pushed back toward their own inertia, but the erosion would be slower now, because there were people inside the institution who had been changed by being asked to build something, and people outside it who knew what had been promised and would notice if it disappeared. That was not a guarantee. Ethan was under no illusion about that, but it was a stake in the ground, and stakes in the ground were what you drove when you wanted something to hold. He thought about what he would tell someone if they asked him what it all meant, what the lesson was, if there was a lesson. He was skeptical of clean lessons. They usually flatten something real into something usable, and the price of being usable was being less true. But if he had to say something, it would be this. What happened in that lobby was not a story about one bad manager and one good outcome. It was a story about a system that produced that manager, that shaped her instincts and her assumptions, and then put her in a position of power over people, and gave her almost no mechanism for accountability until something broke dramatically. Enough to be captured on video and shared 400,000 times. Most things didn't break that dramatically. Most things just accumulated the delays, the redirections, the particular quality of attention people received or didn't receive, depending on what they looked like when they walked through the door. Those accumulations didn't end up on video. They ended up in the long, patient memory of the people who experienced them, which mostly went unrecorded and unaddressed, which meant the system never got the signal that it needed to change. Ethan had been in a specific position with a specific piece of paper and a specific amount of money and the specific accident of someone having her phone out at the right moment. He hadn't earned those conditions. He'd inherited some of them and stumbled into others. What he'd done with them, that part was his. But the conditions themselves were luck, plain and uncomfortable. The uncomfortable part of that was that it meant the fix wasn't individual. It wasn't about finding more people who would respond the way he had. It was about building structures that didn't require the luck of a video and a $5 million check to produce accountability. That was what the ombudsperson was for. That was what the audit was for. That was what Donna Reyes was for, expanding into a space the facilities team was slowly losing their standoff over. He wasn't naive enough to think Meridian First National was fixed. He was honest enough to say it was better. Better than it was a year ago. Better than it would have been if he'd taken the money and walked. Better in ways that were small and operational and would mostly be invisible to the people they helped, because that was how it worked when things actually changed. The absence of a bad experience was invisible, because the person who didn't have the experience didn't know what they'd been spared. The woman at window 2 in July being helped without hesitation. She would never know. There was nothing to know, from her perspective. She'd gone to the bank and done her transaction and gone on with her day. That was the whole thing. That was, in a very real sense, what success looked like. Someone having an ordinary experience they'd simply take for granted, while a year's worth of work and process and pressure sat invisibly underneath it, holding it up. He could live with invisible. He was, in fact, glad of it. He went to bed at 10:30. He slept better than he had in a while, which he noticed and was grateful for in a plain, unadorned way. Not everything needed more than that. The back porch renovation finished in the spring. He'd done most of it himself on weekends, with help from a carpenter friend 2 Saturdays in a row, and a great deal of opinionated supervision from Mia, who had decided at some point that she had preferences about lumber and was not shy about expressing them. The finished porch had new boards throughout, a railing that no longer leaned, and a small corner section that Mia had helped paint carefully, with a brush she held too tight and fixed twice in a blue that she'd picked out herself from a row of paint swatches at the hardware store. She'd called it a good blue. He agreed with her. It was. On the first warm evening after it was done, they sat out there together after dinner, she with a book, he with coffee, the yard doing its spring thing, new leaves, the neighbor's dog making its regular assessment of the fence line. It was ordinary in the way that the best evenings were ordinary, nothing happening, nothing needing to happen, just the specific weight of a good day settling into a good night. Mia looked up from her book. "Dad, is the porch done now?" Mostly, she gave him the look. "What's left?" "The light fixture." "That's it?" "That's it." She went back to her book. He drank his coffee. The dog next door finished its inspection and went inside. The light was the kind of evening light that made things look like themselves, but slightly better, which was the thing about late spring evenings in this part of the world that had always gotten him. He thought about his grandfather buying 12 acres on Route 9 in 1961 for $12,000 cash. He thought about his father keeping the jaw set and coming home from the meetings and not talking about what the meetings were like. He thought about Mia's crooked house painting with the figure in the jacket looking at something outside the frame. He thought about all the things he'd tried to explain this year to Mia and Sandra and Diane and Adrian Brooks in a room full of lawyers, and how none of the explanations had quite contained the whole thing, because the whole thing was too big and too tangled and too ordinary at its core to fit into anything clean. The thing at the core of it was this: people deserved to walk into a room and be seen as people, not as what they were wearing, not as what they might or might not be worth, not as a category to be quickly processed and managed. Just people with things they needed and the right to have those things addressed with basic decency. That was it. That was the whole thing. It was so simple it was almost embarrassing, which was maybe why it kept being so hard. He set down his coffee cup, looked at the yard, looked at his daughter reading her book in the good blue corner of a finished porch on a spring evening that had nothing wrong with it. He'd spent a lot of his life proving things. He was tired of proving things. He was ready to just be in rooms and have that be enough, and to keep building toward a version of the world where that was true for more people, quietly, without needing it to be a story. The light held for another half hour. Then it went the way all light went, slowly and without drama, and they went inside.